Let's dive into Matthew chapter 26 tonight. Man, we've been on a long road. I don't know if you remember 25, 24, 23, 22, 21. I mean, we've been on a little bit of a ride where back in chapter 21, Jesus enters Jerusalem, if you remember. And here we have at the beginning of chapter 26, like we've mentioned before, the very first words are those when Jesus had finished, signifying the end of a discourse. And where does he go next? Well, he makes a prediction about his crucifixion, but then in verse 3, it's the first thing that's mentioned after this long discourse. Then the chief priests and elders of the people. When was the last time we heard about the chief priests and elders being somewhere? Do you remember? I'll help you out. Chapter 21, verse 23, when he had entered the temple. Do you remember? Right after the triumphal entry, he entered the temple, and the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him, and they started challenging his authority. And then he goes on that multi-chapter discussion, right? Where they're not really, they're part of the discussion, but they're not really there interacting with him. Prior to that, we had some interaction. So here we are in chapter 26. Not too much left in the book of Matthew. I don't know if you've noticed. We're getting near the end. And before I dive into this very long chapter, let me just preface it by saying that the likelihood of me talking about something that you're interested in from this chapter is very low. I mean, there's so much to cover, and I've picked 3 or 4 things, but they're probably not what you're interested in, but they're what I'm interested in. So that's where we're going. And we're going to start by kind of following up with something we've been talking about the last 2 weeks, this coming of the Son of Man language, and how potentially we've misunderstood that language as referring to the second coming of the Son of Man. That's how a lot of times we read it in modern day. But it has a context that we can't ignore, an original context out of Daniel chapter 7, the coming of the Son of Man in a vision where he's not coming back to earth, but where is he going? He's coming into the throne room in heaven in a vision. So the coming of the Son of Man is really a statement that refers to that vision, and it's a statement that says, when the Son of Man comes, you will see some ramification of that, that he is sitting in a position of authority that he's currently not in. And so all through the last few chapters, I've mentioned it, in Matthew 24, 27, he says it. In verse 30, he uses that language. In 37 of chapter 24, he uses it. 39, 44, and then last week, there was the Matthew 25, 31 passage that we talked about. But when the Son of Man comes in glory, and I just want to reiterate, there's one more in this chapter, and I don't know if you noticed it when you went through, but there's one more in this chapter that we're in this week, and I want to point some interesting things out. It's in chapter 26, verse 57, so we're jumping down to the end, and then we're going to repeat and go back up, so do a little slingshot there. So, it seems, in context, that Jesus is having this conversation with Caiaphas the high priest, right? But look who is also around. Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. So you got the high priest, the scribes. Scribes, big fan of Jesus? No. Elders? No. Boom. Okay. So they're all gathered around. Peter's following at a distance. We'll skip that for now. And then a little bit further down, in verse, let's jump to 61. They get a man that states, oh, I heard him say I'm able to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And then, so this starts some questioning of Jesus. you say this? Jesus doesn't really respond at first. And it says, the high priest, Caiaphas, comes at him and says, you've got to answer this. And then Jesus says this, verse 64. You have said it yourself, talking directly to the high priest, Caiaphas, right? Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see what? The Son of Man, Daniel 7 reference, sitting at the right hand of power, a reference from a psalm. You can check your cross references there. And coming on the clouds of heaven, back to Daniel 7. He's talking to whom? Caiaphas. And he says, you have said it yourself. And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. Now, if that's referring to his second coming, like we have often read it, like I have often read it, that's a confusing statement to Caiaphas, is it not? Because he's not going to be alive because the second coming has not yet happened in our context today. There's also something else that kind of throws a loop in this. Caiaphas died. Do anybody know? Besides Julie? Because I know she knows. Caiaphas died in AD 36. When was the temple destroyed? That event that I've been kind of promoting to you as this is the example of the coming of the Son of Man, that he has gotten into his position of authority, that he's going to send the Roman army to surround Jerusalem. This is the last few chapters, right? And ultimately destroy it and remove these people from power, right? When did that happen? AD 70. Caiaphas died in AD 36. Seems like a bit of an issue possibly. Well, there's something cool going on here that I didn't really know at first until I looked into it, and it has to do with the Greek language behind the English translation that we have. English is a great language, very confusing. I taught it for a couple years. One of the downsides of English is in the common vernacular, we have a solution for it, but in formal English, we have a you that functions as a plural you and a singular you. It's the same word. And so if I say, you're going to be here next week, you don't really know unless you see me gesture, you're going to be here, or you're going to be here next week, right? You don't know if I'm talking to one person or many people. Greek, on the other hand, has two different words for plural you and singular you. So when you're reading it in the Greek, you can see that. You can't see it in our translation. Okay, what's the common vernacular way of solving this problem in English? You all, yeah. You just move to Texas for a little bit, and you'll pick up on it. So it's got the you and the you all, right? Okay, so if you dive back into this, I've got the yous highlighted in yellow here. Jesus said it to him, you have said it yourself. I'm going to just let you guess. Singular or plural? Singular. You have said it yourself. Caiaphas, you have said it yourself. Now, the other two change to plural. So hear what Jesus is saying. He says, you, Caiaphas, have said it yourself. You've answered your own question. Nevertheless, I tell you all. Who's he talking to? The scribes and the elders who have gathered together with the high priest. Is he talking to them individually? Probably collectively as a group of leaders, correct? Caiaphas, I imagine, if I went and did some research, or if we did, I would imagine Caiaphas may not be the only person there that day that died prior to AD 70. But his next statement, this Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, both plural used. Nevertheless, I tell you all here, you leadership of Israel, hereafter you all will see the ramifications of the Daniel 7 prophecy having been fulfilled out of your eyesight, but you'll see the ramifications here in this context. And how does that play out? Well, God uses a foreign pagan army to come and judge his people. And you might say, man, that doesn't sound like the God I believe in. Well, all you have to do is go back in the Old Testament when Babylon was sent, right? In fact, there's even a prophecy where the prophet's saying, it's going to send Babylon to judge you and take you away. And then the very next statement, what does he say? Oh, and then Babylon will be judged for doing that. Okay? So this is not a new thing. Just wanted to point that out. Promise no more Son of Man, unless Jesus says it again, and then I'll mention it. So, if we pop back up to 26 verse 12. We're talking about the Passover meal. I know you had some questions about it in your lesson. This is also found in Mark 14, in Luke 22. They all present this as a Passover meal. John, though, interestingly enough, seems to put it at slightly a different time, a day earlier. And if you do any type of research on this, if you find this fascinating to find out how that week of Jesus' death, burial, resurrection went, you'll find many different theories as to when certain events happen from here on out. I'm not going to try and solve those for you. I have my own opinion, but I will not tell them because I'm likely very wrong. And I just want you to know that if you read Mark and Luke, it sounds like the sacrificed lamb is being sacrificed, and so they're having a Passover meal where a lamb would be present. That happens at a certain point. John makes it sound like it's a day earlier than that. That's where the controversy is, okay? What I will mention is this. Now, that's in John 13, by the way, where you can find that. I will mention this, that this Passover meal, whether there was a lamb there or not that night, is a meal that had been happening for over 1,000 years, okay? It was full of symbolism. And some of your questions had you go seek some of that out. And it's interesting, Jesus doesn't say much about why he's going to die. He does mention that he's going to die along the way in his ministry, but he doesn't say a lot about why. But here, he hosts a very symbolic meal, and during this meal, what we see is him taking the symbols that had been in place for centuries, and he's twisting them and redirecting them to point at him. And that's what he's doing in this meal, okay? His hope by the end of the meal is to transform the Passover meal into a meal of new symbolism. And I will just mention, I think he did pretty good. Matthew 26:20, let's take a look at it. Jesus was reclining at the table. That's what it says. Do you see it? Reclining at the table with his 12 disciples. Now I want to stop here, have a little fun. When I read that verse 20, he's reclining at the table with 12 disciples. Does a picture pop into your head at all? From recliner. What's that?
A recliner.
Okay, a recliner. So a hammock. I mean, okay,
yeah.
Several.
A fainting couch.
What's that?
Fainting couch.
Okay, a fainting couch. I have to admit, these are not the answers I was expecting. You've done it once again to me. I should learn that if I go in directions that you're not expecting, that likely you will take me sideways as well. Let me ask a more specific question. Is there a certain piece of artwork that maybe our generation and previous generations have become familiar with that might pop into your head when I read this verse?
The Last Supper.
The Last Supper. Da Vinci's Last Supper. That's what I was going for. Whew. Well, unbeknownst to you, most of you, some of you know this, I have a small but very well-respected collection of high-quality Last Supper art. I don't know if you knew that about me. It's a little quirky thing that I have. I've been collecting it over the years. I brought some of it with me tonight, and I'd like to share that with you. And I have a reason why I'm doing this, but The first one is this. This is a bookmark from Jerusalem. Just show the video there. Of the Last Supper. High quality. I can't tell you how much I paid for this. Because I didn't pay anything for this. It was a free giveaway. But this is a depiction of Da Vinci's Last Supper, right? You all have it in your head, so this is also a chance for me to tell my favorite, one of my two favorite church jokes. I'll tell my favorite church joke first. It has nothing to do with this. Did you all hear about the skunk that went to church? No? Yeah, he sat in his own pew. That's my all-time favorite. My second one is this. Okay, you guys have been reading, studying this chapter. You know what the last thing Jesus said at the Last Supper? You do, right? No, he said, okay, everybody on this side of the table for a picture. Okay. That really is the smallest piece of Last Supper artwork. I'm now going to the biggest piece of Last Supper artwork, and I don't know if I can fit it on the video. But this, I'm just going to try and get it on the video here, all of it. You've seen Velvet Elvis, right? You've seen Dogs Playing Poker.
Yes.
Yeah. This is Carpet Last Supper. I don't know if you've noticed before I turned it around, it's on a high quality pressboard paneling from the 70s. I do have to give credit where credit is due. This is actually owned by a gentleman that used to be the football coach at McNary High School, Isaac Parker. It's been on permanent loan to me since he got married. Because before he got married, he had it in his dining room. So it's been in my office. You're welcome to come by and look at it after class tonight or anytime in my office. It's hanging right above the couch. You thought I was kidding. I have more. This was hanging around the church somewhere. I don't remember where I found it, but I adopted it. Oh, it was in the fireside room yeah, that's right. And when they painted or something, they took it down. It's a little, what would you call this from an art standpoint? What's that? Abstract? I was going to say cubism, but I'd say like triangularism or something. Okay. Quickly showing my ignorance. Okay. That's that. All those are on one side of the table. The reason I really am doing this is because somebody donated this picture to the church a few years ago. And it is a beautiful picture, and it's actually a piece of art. Probably worth something, so I'm being very careful. But this is a piece of art that probably depicts a little more what the scene looked like. If you notice, it says they're reclining at the table. So sitting in chairs is not what they were doing. So they're probably around. Likely other people there preparing the meal. Okay, so just kind of keep that in your mind as we go through. I will leave this up here, and I'll be very careful around it. That's all. The meal is called a Seder meal, and the modern form that is practiced today that you may be very familiar with, because some Christians spend a little bit of time getting to know what the Seder meal symbolism is. Likely today's version is very different from the one that Jesus was involved in his day. His is probably much more simple. But all throughout this Seder meal, there are symbols that remind the people involved in the meal about the history of the Israelite nation, of the nation of Abraham, that descended from Abraham. And so I'm not going to go through all of it, but I want to hit some high points. Somewhere early in the Seder meal, there's an event, some symbolism that happens that recalls the story of Joseph. Now, who's Joseph? Joseph is the son of Jacob. And Joseph gets sold into slavery by his brothers. And I don't know if you remember the story, but they wanted to kill him, right? And one of the brothers speaks up and says, hey, let's not kill him. Let's sell him into slavery for the rest of his life. That would be better. And then what they did was they sold him to a caravan, and he got taken down to Egypt. And what they did is they took the favorite coat that the father had given, right? And they killed a goat and took the blood from the goat, put it on the coat, and then took the coat to the dad and said, your son's been killed. Now, why would the Seder meal start with that story? Any ideas? What is that story the start of? It's the start of Joseph going where? Down to Egypt. And if you know the history in the Old Testament, what does that lead to? Eventually, the whole descendants of Jacob end up going. The whole family ends up going down in a drought later. Joseph has worked his way up to a very high place in the Egyptian society. And for a while, Abraham's descendants, Jacob's family, end up in favor in Egypt under Pharaoh. But then what happens? Over a period of time, give you a real brief history here, they multiply. You remember that story? They become enslaved because the Pharaoh switches out, one dies, and a new Pharaoh comes in that's not familiar with this family and why they're here. And because now there's so many of them, they're a threat. And so they become enslaved in Egypt. Then, after a while, Pharaoh begins to kill. He starts a genocide. I don't know if you remember the story, but he starts killing all the baby boys and putting all the grown men to hard labor, and in so doing, killing them off as well, just through their work. But the God of Abraham raises up a deliverer, right? A man named Moses. And after 10 acts of justice, the plagues, where there's a chance to relent throughout the process, Pharaoh has a chance to relent throughout the entire process of the plagues. After this last plague, Pharaoh lets these people go, Moses' people. And the people are led out of slavery from under the oppression of the evil rulers. Okay? This is the story that is recounted in the Seder meal every year. And it's through the replaying of this story every year that every new generation gets brought into that story in the Jewish faith. Some of the different things are involved in this. There's unleavened bread involved in this meal. Why is it unleavened? Well, a bread that doesn't have leaven doesn't have what? Yeast, right? And that goes back to the original, where they were in a hurry getting out of Egypt, and they didn't have time for the bread to rise, because that takes process, so they had unleavened bread for a period of time while they were on the move. So during this meal, they eat that unleavened bread. And bread, not on the diet I'm currently on, where carbs are prohibited. I'm really upset about that. Bread seems to be the sustenance of life. Okay, it is that food that people generally go to that fills their belly more often than not. And in this meal, in chapter 26, verse 26, Jesus drops a little bit of a bomb right in the middle of the meal. I don't know if you noticed it. He hands out the bread and people are chomping away on it. And he says, oh, by the way, this is my body. What in the world? If I was in a younger crowd, I would say, what the what? Because that's what they say. I don't know what it means, but he says, this is my body. What he's doing again is taking the symbol and he's turning it. Because over the next few hours even, Jesus' body would undergo what? Some kneading, some flattening. He'd be thrown into an oven and baked, right? But he would come out of that oven as what? The sustenance of life. And so he said, I want you to take this symbol and when you take this meal, speaking of the Seder meal that he was a part of, as a history of these people, I want you to continue that history, but the history is going to now turn and point to me. He's not hijacking anything. What is he doing? He's actually fulfilling what the original intent of the symbol was, unbeknownst to a lot of people. So, the bread. Now the lamb may have been a part of this meal, but it's not really mentioned. So, because it's not mentioned specifically within the meal context, a lot of people say, well, the lamb, this was done early, it was before the lambs would have been slaughtered at a specific time, right? So likely there may not have been a lamb there. I'm not going to dive into it too much more, but you can read up on it. What's the symbolism of the lamb of Passover? This is the last plague, the plague of the firstborn, right? Where they would slaughter the lamb, they would collect its blood, and what would they do with that blood? They would put it on the doorpost, the threshold of the door, and over the windows. If you read it carefully, it's over the windows too, which window seals. And that was the sign that you have people of faith in that household. Okay? And those people were protected by the blood of that lamb that they had killed. It's a substitutionary theory there. So it was through the death of that lamb that the people gained their passage out of Egypt in the Passover. And if the lamb was not there at that meal in symbolic form, it was there in the form of Jesus. Because he took that and pointed it back at himself and said, I am that sacrifice. It is my blood that you will wear on your bodies that will bring you out of slavery and to a place of life and rest. And there was also a cup. We read about it a little bit in 26-27. This is where he drops another bomb. I don't know if you noticed that. As they're drinking, Jesus says, oh, by the way, this is my blood. Right? But he uses specific language. We looked at it a little bit in your context. He said, this is the blood of the new covenant. In contrast to the blood of the old covenant, which was a Mosaic covenant, a covenant that was given shortly after these events that the Seder meal is remembering. Remember, they went through the Red Sea, they went to Mount Sinai, they got the law. That's the old covenant. And we took you back to Exodus 24 in your lesson, and I'm just going to suggest to you that there's a couple things, pictures going on here that probably are worth mentioning. Jesus is asking them to take that cup and apply it to the threshold of their hearts. How does he ask them to do it? By ingesting it, right? It's not an exterior holiness that he's been arguing against the Pharisees practicing. It's an interior symbol. That's what it becomes. And in the Exodus 24 chapter, you see Moses doing what with blood of a sacrificial animal after reading the law? He sprinkles it on the people. And in a similar ceremony, you might suggest that the ingesting of that is the turn of events that makes this new covenant a different covenant, not one that regulates exterior behavior, but interior thoughts and behavior. So all along we've been mentioning, I've been mentioning, that Matthew is painting Jesus as what type of character? He's the new what? He's the new Moses. He is the new person, agent sent from God to earth on behalf of the people of Israel. And he has been sent to pull them out of a condition of slavery from an evil oppressor. And oftentimes we think that's the Romans, but Jesus didn't have much of a beef with the Romans compared to the beef he had with the religious temple leadership. And we've seen that in great fashion. There's something else going on here that I want to mention. Not only is Jesus a new Moses, that's wrapping in. What we're doing is we're going back in the Old Testament. We're getting all these symbols and types and shadows of Christ coming out of the Old Testament, and we're wrapping it all up because we're getting really close to the crucifixion, which is the singular event that everything in the Old Testament was pointing to. And so you would expect that other things are being brought out of the Old Testament, that Matthew would be doing this as an author, just to remind the people what it is that Jesus did as he writes his. So let's consider this. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 3. Where are we in Genesis 3? Adam and Eve. They've been created in chapter 2, and then what do? They make an unwise decision, right? When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, now listen to the verbs of what she did. She took from its fruit and ate. And she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. What are the verbs? She took, she gave, and they ate. Right? Centuries later, Jesus, who's sharing a meal with his disciples, and the way Matthew tells it, he says, while they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after a blessing, he broke it and gave it and said, "Take, eat." Centuries later, after the woman and the man listen to the serpent and follow his advice. And then in prophecy in Genesis 3:16, where it's the seed of that woman that will do what? That will fix the problem. He'll be wounded in the process on the heel, but he will crush the head of the serpent, right? Who is that? It's Jesus. Paul makes that very clear in a couple different places. And here Jesus is at his last meal. And the way Matthew, these aren't red letters, all of them, so the way Matthew is describing this, I'm just going to propose to you that he's bringing in the verbs that led to the fall, and he's redeeming those very verbs as Jesus does the same action as he takes, as he gives, and as they eat. Redemption is brought to all of humanity in the same way that sin entered all of humanity. So, we're going to finish on kind of a different note. If you go down to verse 36, a couple years ago I wrote some curriculum for the Sunday school classes on prayer. Some of you are around for that. This episode in the garden was one of the episodes we looked at because it's Jesus praying. And there's some curious things that I pointed out in those lessons, and I'll just briefly mention a couple of them. Jesus has been saying for years that he's going to die, right? He even gets corrective with people that try and say he's not going to die. And here, on the very eve of that event happening, what we find is him in the garden. And what is he asking? He's asking if I don't have to, it sure would be nice, right? And I don't know if you noticed something, and this was my point when I wrote the lesson a couple years ago. Jesus doesn't just pray this thing once. He goes and prays and says, I would really love for this cup, this crucifixion, this thing I've got to drink, to be taken away from me. And then he goes and has, a little wake-up session with his disciples. And he comes back, and it says in the Matthew and other versions, he says basically the same verbs, a little bit different, slightly different. We looked at that. And then in another wake-up session, right? And then it goes back, and Matthew just simply says, and he went back, and he said basically the same thing again. He prayed 3 times. And coming out of that study that I did and preparing for the Sunday school lessons that I prepared for, I asked the question, why 3 times? It seems odd to me Number one, that he did it once. That's okay, but I get past that. And here you got Jesus, who's been talking about his crucifixion for years, asking 3 times. But he doesn't ask a 4th time. Now you might say, well, the soldiers came, he didn't have a chance, maybe he would have kept praying. Okay, and that's possible. But he went from that, and when the soldiers did come, he was fully resigned to, I'm going into this, right? So whatever happened in those 3 times didn't happen after 1 time. It also didn't happen after 2 times. But after the 3rd time, the way it's presented, Jesus had gotten his answer. He had worked through the situation with the Father, and he was ready to go, right? Now, that's interesting enough just by itself. But if you jump over to John chapter 17, his version of what happens in the garden includes a high priestly prayer that's not included in the others. And in this version, Jesus is praying that he will be restored to the glory that he once held, and he's looking forward to a glorious reunion in the heavenly realms. And it's this glorious reunion that then leads him to a crown of thorns, right? A thorn in the flesh. Many thorns in the flesh. And here's where we're going to take a left-hand turn, because you're probably not guessing where I'm going with this. But Paul, in Galatians 2:20, says a very interesting statement. He says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. Now let me ask you hopefully a simple question. Was Paul on the cross with Christ? No, he wasn't. Okay, he wasn't even identified with Christ when the cross happened. But here he says, I have been crucified with Christ. This is a true statement, but it is a theological truth. In the Greek language, we would call this a logos, the truth, the understanding. And it's these truths that are expressed, that are often expressed and shown through stories. And in the Greek, those are called the mythos. You might hear our word myth out of that, right? We've got a connotation when we say myth. What kind of a story are we telling? Fictitious, a make-believe story. That's our connotation. In the Greek culture, a myth, or the mythos, doesn't necessarily have a true or false connotation. It's just a story. It could very likely be true. It could also very likely be fictitious. But it is the stories. So the Bible is telling a mythos from the Greek standpoint. It's a true story, but it's a myth. It's a series of events. And so Paul in Galatians 2:20 says, I have been crucified with Christ. That is the logos side, the reasoning, the truth side. And then we would expect the story of Paul to show the mythos of why that's true, how that plays out in the story that he has been crucified with Christ. Now, if you're not following me, you're in good company. So let's just flip to the end of Galatians, and I want to point out a couple things, and I think this will be worth our while. At the very end of Galatians, chapter 6, verse 17, it says, From now on, let no one cause trouble for me, for I bear on my body the brand marks of Jesus. What versions do you have? And what do your versions say there for brand marks? If you notice. Galatians 6:17, I'll get back to it. So keep looking. The Greek word behind it is what our word is stigma. I actually had to look it up because I didn't know what a stigma was, the formal definition. A stigma is a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance or person. Paul says, I have the stigma, plural, stigmata, the brand marks on my body to show that I have been crucified with my Savior. So if that's true, if Paul is saying a logos there, you would expect the mythos to follow up and show that he actually does have brand marks on his body. Let me just point out a couple things. In Acts 16:22, we have Paul and Silas imprisoned. And what happens when they're imprisoned? Well, they tear the robes off of them, and they beat them with rods, and they struck them with many blows. Later, in a different context, Paul, who's going through everything he's been through, lists that he's been whipped several times. Struck them with many blows. They threw him into prison. He's guarded securely. In the inner prison he's thrown, and then in verse 24 it says, and they fastened their feet in the stocks. Now here I have stocks in yellow because it's a good translation. Stocks is what they put his feet into. But the Greek behind that word is the word wood. And in other places in the New Testament, it's the exact same Greek word that's translated as the tree that Jesus was put on. It's also translated as the word cross. So the mythos, the story that backs up the logos claim of Paul that he has the stigma of Christ, the multiple brand marks of Christ, that he has been crucified with him. Here he is beaten and whipped, and his feet are fastened to the tree. Now, is it nailed in? No. But is that important in the mythos of the story? No, it's not. If we flip to Acts 28:3, he's on a shipwreck and he lands on Malta. And they're cold, so they start to kindle a fire. And verse 3, when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a what pops out? A viper came out because of the heat and fastened it where? On his hand. Paul's feet have been fastened to the tree, and his hand has been bitten by the viper. Now, did this really happen? Yes, it really happened. But does this have significant symbolic meaning as it's being relayed as a mythos to back up the truth that Paul himself, and we, by the way, have been crucified with Christ as believers? All right, all that to say, 2 Corinthians 12, 1 through 10, Paul has a vision of glory. I don't know if you remember this. He says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, he's very, you know how people talk in the third person. He's actually trying to probably distance himself from this just to not be braggadocious. But he says, I know a man, it's him, who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or out of the body I do not know, but God knows, and such a man was caught up into the third heaven. And I know how such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, God knows, okay, it's very repetitive here, was caught up into paradise and heard unexpressible words. He has a vision of heaven, a glorious vision. And it's this vision that he comes out of in verse 6, and he says, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, coming out of a glorious vision, he is sent to a place where he receives a thorn in the flesh. Do you see that? To keep me from exalting myself, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh. Now, I've taught this several times, and I always go to rose bushes because we have some rose bushes at our house. And I absolutely hate when I get a thorn in my hand from a rose bush, right? So I can identify with the pain a little bit, maybe. But from a mythos standpoint, from a what's happening in the text here, Paul comes out of this vision of glory, something yet future, where he will be in a glorious realm, and it's undescribable. But to keep him grounded, he's sent to a place where he has a thorn in the flesh. And so let's just review. What are the stigma? What are the Christoformic forms that Paul has? His feet have been connected to the tree. His hands have been wounded by the viper. And he's got a thorn in the flesh. He's been beaten. on his back, almost to death. And he has been crucified with Christ. You see how the mythos backs up the logos statement? This is happening throughout the New Testament, and it's fascinating when you look for it. And all that to say, I mentioned it earlier, Paul has been crucified with Christ, and his message to us in those letters, in that letter of Galatians, his message to us is we have a cross to bear as well. We have a glorious future ahead. But that glorious future, the message of the New Testament is not wealth and happiness. The message of the New Testament is suffering that leads to glory. How do I know that? Because my Christ went through that. And he's my example, and he's the one that has asked me to pick up my cross and you yours as people of faith. Let's pray. Dear God, thanks for tonight. Thanks for this chapter as we head into the events that lead to your death and are reminded that this was an unpleasant event. It was not something that anyone would want to go through. And sometimes life brings us into events that no one would want to go through. But God, you have promised a glorious future, a glory yet to come. And we hold on to that hope and that promise. And we endure the stigma that this life brings. Help us do that. Help us do that as we endure. In Jesus' name, amen.